Hello everyone, welcome to another one of our introductory videos. This one is for chapter 21 of the Foner textbook, The New Deal. Now this particular video, I'm going to try and pack as much as I possibly can in to as small a space as possible, so I'll go kind of quickly here. But we're going to kind of pick up the story actually before FDR comes into office, because in the last chapter in the introductory video I really just kind of talked about the 1920s themselves, really kind of left out the crash of 1929. So we're really going to kind of pick it up from there in this particular video. So one of the things I want to kind of clear up is the fact that there is a bit of an impression out there that the Republican president at the time, Herbert Hoover, really doesn't respond to the Great Depression, this fantastic crash of the American economy, that it basically sits back and waits for it to heal itself. Now, in some small ways that is true. But in the larger measure, really, Hoover does try to enact a series of policies to try and rectify this situation. He understands that quickly the American economy is spiraling out of control. It's just really collapsing in on itself. So he does try to do some things, but because of the limited development of the discipline of economics at the time and the fact that the American government just didn't have all the apparatus it needed, a lot of his fixes were very small in scale or very limited in what they could accomplish. But some of the things he did put in place were also kind of limited in the fact that they just didn't do what was really intended for them to do. A prime example of this is a Smoot-Hawley Tariff that was passed in 1930 right after the crash, where the U.S. government slapped higher taxes on any imports coming into the United States in an attempt to kind of protect American domestic producers, to make sure that Americans would buy American goods and keep the American economy going as strongly as it could. Problem with this was, at the time, the United States is a net exporter. We actually export more items than we actually consume in the United States. So once our trading partners, places like Europe, where most American goods actually went, saw the United States taxing their goods, and they were hit by the Depression just as badly as the United States was, they reciprocated. They passed their own taxes on American goods, and that hurt American companies even more, because while Europeans would sell and buy from each other, they quickly started turning away from American goods because of the high tariffs that they placed on those American goods, which meant the United States, a net exporter, lost even more money, made the Great Depression even worse. So one of the first acts the Hoover administration has actually makes the situation even worse than it was before. Another step that the Hoover administration takes, and it shows that even a laissez-faire kind of capitalist president like Herbert Hoover still understands that the federal government has to act, is a thing called the Reconstruction Finance Corp. Right? So in 1932, the United States government, under the auspices of the Hoover administration, pushes through Congress this big spending bill, about a $500 million spending spree by the federal government to lend money to banks to stabilize them so they quit going out of business and quit damaging the economy more, and to give jobs to big businesses so that they will hire workers or at least keep their workers that they have employed and getting them paychecks. So hundreds of millions of dollars are pumped into the economy. It's going to help stabilize banks. Failures are going to drop in number. There's not going to be as many banks collapsing each week, taking with it not just money out of the economy, but money out of people's pockets. So that does stabilize the situation. Problem is, to pay for the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the Hoover administration actually raises taxes. Again, they're kind of laissez-faire capitalists. If you spend money, you got to take money in. So as they're pumping money into the economy in one spot, they're actually pulling it out in another. So in the end, this big, massive bill, which actually helps finance things like the Hoover Dam outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, ends up doing not much good. It really doesn't impact the economy very much at all. Also, another piece that was pushed through, the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, again pushes a lot of money into the United States economy, especially through banks. This particular bill was a way to try and save good banks from being taken down by bad banks, to give the United States government some authority to step in and take over failing banks and keep them from going under and destroying the economy further. So the United States government is taking actions here, but those actions are really limited, and for a lot of people, really kind of feel that the Hoover administration is really taking care of banks and businesses, but letting people suffer. As more and more Americans lost their jobs and in turn lost their homes, had to go out and live on the streets, or what they would start calling Hoovervilles, little squatting homeless camps is what we'd call them today, little squattervilles. And these ramshackle little homes built out of just, garbage in some cases, or just, leftover materials laying on the streets. people really started looking at the Hoover administration for help, and they didn't feel that there was any coming. That they really saw the Hoover administration as uncaring, that they were on their own, right? Some of that left over to that Gilded Age mentality that we've seen before. But what really kind of puts an exclamation point on this feeling is what happens in 1932, just a few months before the electoral process begins in the United States, right? Because 1932 is a presidential election year. And in 1932, about 20,000 World War I vets go to Washington, D.C., demanding that they be paid a bonus. Now, when they had joined up to fight in World War I in 1917, 1918, those that volunteered were promised a bonus by the U.S. government that was to be paid in 1943. Well, a lot of these veterans, there were millions of people that participated in the war, but tens of thousands of these veterans decided they needed that money now, early. And we're talking about $143 per person, I think is what it was, or about $150 each. So in their terms, it was a good amount of money, but it wasn't a tremendous sum in any way, shape, or form. So they go to Washington, D.C., these veterans, to demand the early payment of this bonus. Congress denies it, says, no, you were promised in 1943, we're going to give it to you in 1943. Once again, Congress seeing that they can't spend money they don't have, right? Kind of this laissez-faire capitalist mentality. So eventually, most of the veterans end up going away. But about 2,000 stay throughout the summer, saying, we want our bonus, trying to keep attention, trying to get the government to kind of back down and to give in to them. Eventually, the Hoover administration gets tired of these squatters living in parks all throughout the Washington, D.C. area. So he calls in the Army. And the Army responds with not only troops with guns, but with tanks, mounted officers on horses, and they go through and they chase off the veterans, but not before violence breaks out and you see veterans being shot at by active duty military members. When this is captured on newsreels and is shown throughout the theaters in the United States before feature films, many Americans are shocked that their government is actually attacking people that are in need. When the election comes, people remember this event. They remember how many people are homeless now that need help from the government, and it doesn't seem like the Hoover administration is helping. So when it comes time to make a choice in the polls, Americans overwhelmingly choose Hoover's opponent. And one of the reasons why this process is so bad, right, is that all throughout the Great Depression, unemployment is extremely high, right? 18%. That'd be about double, almost triple what we saw during the financial crisis of like 2008, 2009, right? And in some places, it's even worse. Places like Cleveland and Toledo, Ohio, kind of the hub of the industrial heart of America, their unemployment rates could be as high as 50, sometimes 80%. And then there's even underemployment. Even if you had a job, you weren't working full-time anymore. So a lot of people had lost a lot of pay. A lot of Americans, the average worker might make about $2,000 a year. If you still had your job during the Great Depression, now you're making $1,500 a year just because you lost hours or weren't working full-time. You'd be laid off for extensive periods. So there's a lot going on here during this period, right? And at the same time, a lot of banks are still failing as people need to pull their money out of the banks to pay bills, or they no longer can make deposits. Banks no longer have the money to lend. The people that they've lent money to can no longer repay them, so it causes further collapse. So you can see the American economy is spiraling down out of control during this period. It's no wonder that people want somebody that can step in and really kind of take charge of the situation. Put another way in this chart, right? You can kind of see that in 1929, before the crash, American unemployment was about 5.5%. Today it's around 6.2, 6.3%. Just kind of depends on which poll you're looking at here. So it's within traditional levels. But quickly you can see how fast the unemployment skyrockets during this crisis. You can see all the way up through 1929, 1930 into 1931. By 1933, 25% of the United States workforce is out of work. That is an incredible, incredible burden on the American economy and on American individuals themselves. With that many people out of work, your charities, individual groups just can't possibly help that many people. There are just too many people falling through the cracks by this point. They need help and they want it from somebody. They know that their neighbors can't help them because they're in the same boat. They know that their state and local governments are strapped and unable to care for them. They all start looking towards the federal government. And the Hoover administration has basically said, you're on your own. So in 1932, Americans turned to Hoover's opponent, Franklin Roosevelt, a very familiar face to them. He comes from a old moneyed New York family that includes his cousin Theodore Roosevelt, former president of the United States. So he's really a known quantity to a lot of Americans. He had run for vice president before. When he had lost that election, he kind of retired from politics for a little while on vacation. He got sick with a kind of a paralyzing disease called polio. So he's from the waist down, he was paralyzed. That was kind of known to a lot of Americans that he was stricken by this disease. So it made him seem very accessible to them. That somehow this rich kind of elite person had shared some of the same things that they had shared in their lives. And when he re-entered back into politics in 1926 and won election as governor of New York, when the Great Depression started hitting in his state, he started putting forward a lot of different programs to try and mitigate this disaster, to try and make it easier on Americans, especially working class Americans who were losing their jobs as the factories in New York shut down, as the banks of New York started shutting down. So again, it seemed like this is a guy that really cared, that he was in touch with what was happening, and that he was going to try and do something. As a matter of fact, when he was running for president in 1932, that's a lot of what he was saying, is that he was going to try anything. He didn't care whose idea it was, where it came from. If it looked like it was going to work, he was going to do it. If it worked a little bit, he would try it. If it didn't, he'd get rid of it and try something else. What he would say is he was going to be bold, persistent experimentation, right? He's going to try anything. Keep going until something actually works. So a lot of Americans like that message of a more active government, a government that cared about them and wanted to help them, not just big business and big. Roosevelt not only had a economic catastrophe on his hands that he had to take care of, but he was also confronted with a natural disaster as well. All throughout the early 1930s, a dust bowl started to form in the middle of the United States. The Great Plains states slowly but surely started to erode away in the very strong winds that are normal for that part of the United States. What had happened is all throughout the 1920s, American farmers, in an effort to kind of be able to pay their bills, to keep their income levels where they were, as agricultural prices declined during that decade, ended up planting more intensively, growing larger and larger crop yields on their farms, which depleted the soil. So when a drought started to occur in the early 1930s, it made a bad situation worse and allowed much of the topsoil to be carried away by strong winds that are kind of normal for that part of the plains. So FDR had not only to take care of a United States economy that had collapsed upon itself, he had to somehow inflate that, but he also had to figure out how to deal with this major catastrophe that affected almost a third of the country. About 9 states in the U.S. were affected by this dust bowl that occurs in the 1930s. So there's quite a few challenges on the president's plate when he becomes president of the United States. And this is kind of the after effect of some of those storms. So we are talking about a very powerful event that's happening, because once these dust storms come through, the areas where many Americans live were now uninhabitable. You could not make a living there any longer. The soil would take years to recharge, to build itself back up again, even after rains came back. So it was going to be a long time, and many of those people could not wait, especially in such dire economic circumstances. They had to go find some place where they had money, jobs, could have food, have a livelihood again. And they weren't going to be able to find it in the middle of the United States. So a number of them took to the roads looking for that help. And what they found was it wasn't available almost anywhere. Many of them kept moving west. This is the story of the Okies moving from the central United States, places like Missouri, Oklahoma, even North Texas and New Mexico, parts of Colorado and Nebraska, coming out into places like California looking for jobs, only to find that there weren't any jobs here for them as well, that they were unwelcome and often pushed out to the margins of California society. So California, when these refugees start pouring in, needs help as well. So you can see there's just a lot of issues that have to be solved here during this period of the Great Depression. So when the Roosevelt administration comes in, they really do find a nation in crisis. All these different aspects of crisis are coming together, and the Roosevelt administration has to come to grips with it, find some way to deal with it in a way that the Hoover administration just never could. So there are going to be 3 really major aspects to what the Roosevelt administration is going to try and do. Provide relief for those that are most affected by the Great Depression and by the Dust Bowl, try to get money back in their pockets so they can stay alive and that their families can be taken care of, to recover the economy, to get it back to where it used to be so that Americans were employed again and that the economy was moving forward again, to keep it from shrinking, to causing even more problems and more hardship. And then also reform to make sure that this doesn't happen again, because after all, as we've seen in our other chapters, these economic downturns are coming more frequently now, and they're much more severe every time they come around. The 1890 downturn in the American economy, that depression was also very severe. It scared a lot of Americans, and this one was even worse. So it was starting to become kind of a trend in the United States, and it was something that the Roosevelt administration wanted to try and avoid, if at all possible, going through this event again. So one of the ways that they would get relief is through what we call today, historians call the alphabet soup agencies, right? All these different entities that are going to be created by the Roosevelt administration in what's called the first 100 days. Right? The first 100 days as Roosevelt is president, he's going to push through all kinds of legislation. Because not only do Americans elect Franklin Roosevelt to be president, they choose Democrats overwhelmingly to run the country. Democrats are in office almost everywhere. Republicans have been marginalized during this period. They're a very small minority, really not going to be able to block anything. And with Roosevelt in firm control of the Democratic Party, he's going to be able to push through a lot of his initiatives. Things like the Works Progress Administration that put people back to work, gave them jobs building things like schools, roads, sewers. There's more than 140,000 miles of sewers built in the United States during the Great Depression because of things like the Works Progress Administration. And there's going to be even more agencies. There's a whole litany of them, right? There's things like the Civilian Conservation Corps, started right away in the Roosevelt administration as a way to get young men out of the cities and out into the countryside. Give them a job, get them away from being depressed and being in the cities where they can cause trouble. Help them rebuild national parks. A lot of what we kind of assume to be kind of normal parts of our parks like Yellowstone and Yosemite were built by the Roosevelt administration under the auspices of agencies like the CCC. They even helped farmers, trying to mitigate the effects of the Dust Bowl, to try and help California farmers deal with all these new people that are flooding in, looking for work on their farms. So they try to kind of stabilize farm pricing as well, to try and help that part of the economy recover. Also tried to help business. The National Recovery Act was passed as a way for the federal government to go through and try and regulate businesses, to try and get rid of some of the bad practices that had helped cause the Great Depression, and to funnel federal money through to businesses so that put people back to work. And they also had some of that reform. New government agencies are created, things like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, trying to make sure that the problems that caused the great crash of the stock market and helped put the economy into a tailspin wouldn't happen again, that good banking practices would be enforced, that stocks would be regulated and wouldn't be as free-wielding as they had been in the past and subject to these radical changes in valuations. But even the federal government would get into actually kind of rebuilding America. Things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, things like the Hoover Dam project out west near Las Vegas, were major projects undertaken by the United States that weren't just one thing, one building or one dam. They were whole slews of projects all put into one area. And the Tennessee Valley Authority is one of the most important here. It's going to have parts of 7 states along the Tennessee River Valley and its tributaries, where the federal government's going to go in and build dams for flood control, build power plants to electrify a rural portion of the country that still didn't have electricity in any real way through much of that area, and to also provide social services. Things like bookmobiles, schools are going to all be built under this federal agency. So the federal government gets really involved in Americans' lives. A lot of Americans now have a direct connection to the federal government. And there's one more that the Roosevelt administration pushes through after re-election, right? The biggie, Social Security. All right, now the federal government says it is going to help you if you become too old to work, too tired to work. The federal government is going to make sure that you have an economic floor under you, that you will not starve to death, that you will not be a burden to your family, that the federal government is going to help you out in your elderly years when you can no longer work. So this is a radical transformation of America, right? The Franklin Roosevelt administration really wants to change the relationship of Americans and their government. No longer is the government going to be something in the back seat that's just barely tangible in American lives. Now it's going to be front and center. It's going to be connected to you in almost every way now. from when you're a child through health systems or through schooling, all the way till your retirement when you start collecting Social Security. The federal government is now present in your life in every way. And you can see that some of his policies actually do kind of help out. Here we kind of see a chart. And this first circle here, this part right here, shows what was happening during the Hoover administration as the economy implodes and drops. And what you can kind of see here is as people lose their jobs and stop spending money, that's the blue line, the economy follows right down along with it. And then when we hit that peak of 25% unemployment, these two lines almost touch. The American economy hits basically rock bottom. When FDR comes in and starts pumping starts pumping a lot of federal money into the American economy, you can see that as Americans get jobs or put to work in all those alphabet soup agencies, that slowly but surely things get better. And as the Americans have money and start spending it, the economy starts recovering as well. But it never gets back to that pre-crash level of what we would call the 100% level, right? The amount of money that's going into the economy from the federal government helps, but it can't actually cure the problems. So there's still more that needs to be done, right? At the same time, there are good effects. People are finding work. Even in places like Fresno, these different agencies come through and start building buildings, right? The new city hall for Fresno, built back in the 1940s, right? Now part of the police headquarters. Fresno Unified's, one of its offices was an original schoolhouse building, right? Or a school administration building built in the 1930s. The post office built in the 1930s in downtown Fresno. So you can see even remote areas of the country started having direct connection with the federal government, that these projects put a lot of people to work. Probably one of the best examples of what was happening here is the county records office in downtown Fresno for Fresno County. This particular building put, I want to say 250 workers to work. You can see kind of the detail work here in the windows, where you would need metalsmiths, you would need all kinds of different people, and those what's called an Art Deco design, very popular in the 1930s. So buildings like this are going to put a lot of people to work. Another example of this is the Fresno Memorial Auditorium, also downtown. The sidewalks were part of the WPA projects. The building itself was a WPA project. Put hundreds of people to work for a couple years. But the problem is, once these buildings are finished, once they're done, now what, right? You put people to work for a little while, but not long enough. So you can see that that's why the FDR's New Deal policy doesn't really reinflate the economy. It can keep it off of rock bottom, but it can't really get it going again. The levels are just too small. And at the same time, as FDR seems to be freely spending money, really inflating the economy in a lot of ways, a lot of people start criticizing this. Some political entities that are actually even farther to the left than Roosevelt was start saying that Roosevelt's spending too much money, that he's saddling future generations with too much debt. Some of these arguments should sound a little familiar to us here in the past few decades, right? We've been saying the same things as well. So FDR listens to these critics, these people that are saying he's spending us into oblivion, right? And he starts cutting back on these reliefs as the economy starts improving. He hopes that now it can kind of stand on its own and that the economy can start gaining steam on its own without more federal stimulus, without the effect of spending more federal dollars. Problem is that the minute the Roosevelt administration starts pulling back federal funding, once again, the economy starts going down in a tailspin, right? People start becoming unemployed again. Once again, things are starting to look bad. And this completely went against what the Roosevelt administration had been trying from the beginning, which is kind of following a British economist plan, John Maynard Keynes, a very famous economist of the 1930s, who said that in a depression, when money is so tight, when there's just not enough money around to really make the economy go, it's the government's job to get in there and spend a lot of money, to pump money into the economy. That will help cure the problems and help the economy recover. But of course, the Roosevelt administration didn't feel secure enough politically to be able to do this, that it wanted to answer these critics. So it cut back on the spending, going exactly against what John Maynard Keynes had advised governments to do in these kind of situations. You can kind of see this here in this particular chart, right? When FDR starts cutting government spending and answering critics like Huey Long and others that don't like how much the government is spending and how large the federal deficit is compared to the American economy, right? Once the Roosevelt administration starts cutting New Deal programs and starts cutting that spending, once again, people lose their jobs. Once again, they don't have enough money. Once again, the economy starts going down. What really kind of finally changes the course here and gets the American economy back above 1929 levels isn't FDR's New Deal policies. It's World War II itself. The United States government starts spending such a massive amount of money on war goods, making American factories build goods for the war effort, that it puts virtually all Americans back to work. That once again, people have money to spend and the economy goes up, largely through government spending. But it is a recovery. So what we kind of want to see here is that the New Deal does ease the pain of the Depression, that it makes things better, but it doesn't actually fix the problems. Now, it does put some important reforms in place to make sure these problems don't come back again, but it's going to take a lot of time and really a massive amount of investment, much more than what the government was able to do under Hoover and even under FDR, right? It's going to take a lot more to really heal the economy. But some of the big things is the federal government is now involved in everyday life. Americans know they needed the federal government to help them out in this really dire situation. They demanded that the government help them out, and FDR and the Democrats stepped in and did that and made a very loyal coalition there. Americans are going to vote for FDR 4 times to be president, right? That's how successful his programs are. It's how many Americans come to see him as kind of their leader, the person that's going to take care of them, right? Things like Social Security win over a lot of people. Programs like the TVA, the CCC, the WPA put Americans to work, make them feel that the government is trying to help them to make things better. And also some needed regulations are put into place. American businesses are kind of told how you have to act. Things like the Wagner Act tell businesses you can't treat unions badly, you can't lock them out, you have to deal fairly with unions. So unions become more and more powerful in the 1930s. And exactly the time you would think they would lose power, they actually gain power because the federal government is no longer an enemy to them, is actually actively supporting unionization in the United States. So a lot of changes have happened in the United States. One thing I kind of glossed over is that even the United States government reaches out to minorities for one of the few times it ever has in our history. African Americans, Native Americans are actually made a part of a lot of these New Deal agencies, that the Roosevelt administration makes sure that some black Southerners are actually included in these New Deal programs, that they get jobs as well. So there's a lot of people that feel that they have some say in this, that the government's looking out for them and taking care of them. It's one of the reasons why Franklin Roosevelt is going to be such a popular president and going to be elected 4 times to office. So thank you very much for listening. Please look over the rest of the items for this module, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.